Okay, we'll continue and conclude chapter 4 lecture. Okay, so we're talking about sources of primary data. I mean, remember, this is data that you create the instrument or decide which instrument to use. You go out there and collect the responses. So you're in charge of the variables that will be used in the study. So at this point, we're talking about self-assessments. Sometimes you'll hear this referred to as self-reported data. So basically, you may ask the person, what is your height? What is your weight? And they recall their height and weight and report that. Now, there can be some bias in self-reported data. There's reporting bias that people will respond in a way that they think is socially acceptable or what the researcher wants to hear. Um, in order to address bias, and bias is a whole another topic of what you can do to control it, you have to be aware that where potential for bias exists, and at least at a minimum, think about, is this bias something that is going to be overcome by the sheer number of responses that you get back, or do you want to take active measures to try to minimize bias, maybe rewording questions, doing some random reverse scoring. Like I said, there's a lot of different things to overcome the different types of bias, but at this point, we just want to talk about kind of what the nature of a self-assessment is. So one of the first things, and you should always keep this in mind with any instrument that's used to collect data, is the validity and reliability of your instrument. So you want your respondents to read and interpret a survey question in the exact same way that you intended it to be interpreted. That's not a given. So again, I mentioned before a term called psychometric properties, and that is one of the psychometric properties is validity and accuracy, and is everybody on the same page when they're reading the question, interpreting the question, and then bringing forth a response to the question. So with the self-assessment, you're going straight to the individual. You're asking them questions of a personal nature, or at least questions that require their personal viewpoint. Um, you can collect that. You know, the second bullet, most address primary secondary prevention issues. Recall back to what's the difference between primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention. Remember, primary prevention, the person is in a situation and we want to keep or maintain that situation. So two things you have to consider when determining which level of prevention. One, you have to ask, is there a behavior change required? Primary prevention will always be no. Okay, so if you're working with a group that currently wears seat belts, right, you don't want that behavior to change. If you're working with a group that currently does not smoke cigarettes, you do not want that behavior to change. The other thing you need to consider is the health outcome associated with the behavior that you're interested in. So with seat belts, okay, the disease or condition related to seat belts would be motor vehicle injury. If you're talking about smoking, okay, maybe we're looking at emphysema, COPD, cancer, whatever health status you consider. So you want to again look at your population and assess whether or not they have the condition, or there's any physiological changes that indicate the person may be in a preliminary stage, or they're on their way to developing the condition. So if they don't have the condition, there's no behavior change, and it's primary. If there is a behavior change required and the health condition exists, maybe on a physiological level, maybe the person is experiencing symptoms, but they have not received an official clinical diagnosis, they would be secondary prevention. With tertiary, yes, there's a behavior change that's required, um, and the health condition has been clinically diagnosed. Okay, so they have been diagnosed with a condition. Those individuals would be in tertiary prevention. So the self-assessments, they're completed by the individuals in the priority population. So either you give them a pencil and paper survey or give them a link to an online survey, but they're the ones that are completing the information. And when we're talking about health behaviors and health status, you may want to um, consider the responses being anonymous. Um, some conditions have stigmas associated with them, and a person may not want to volunteer that information if they think they're going to be stigmatized. Anonymity is one way of dealing with it. Um, Another way is through confidentiality. So maybe they do identify themselves, but you assure them that no one outside the research team will have access to that data. Any reports will be stripped of identifiers. So, um, you need to think about, if you were in their shoes, what information you would be forthcoming to provide. Uh, they may need assistance depending on the reading level of your instrument. If there's any health terminology, there may be a health literacy issue. For example, if you ask the person, how many grams of protein do you consume on a daily basis? Depending on the population you're working with, some people may not, have a clue how to convert the proteins that they eat into grams. So, you may want to consider that. You absolutely want to consider that because they're going to respond in some way on your instrument, and you're going to utilize that data as a way to say something about the individual or the population. You want to make sure that that data is valid and reliable. So the different types of health assessments you could include, you have your health risk assessments or health risk appraisals. So here you're basically looking for your independent variables or risk factors. And just to kind of pause and make sure everybody understands the difference between an independent variable and a dependent variable. The dependent variable is the variable that you're interested in, right? You're interested in how that change and what contributes to that change. So the contributory causes to change, that's going to be your independent variables. And your independent variables, that they change first, followed by a change in your dependent variable. So if your health status that you're interested in is COPD, well, then you would want to use an HRA to assess, okay, well, what are the risk factors associated with COPD, and what individuals in my priority population have those risk factors, and kind of gives you a sense of magnitude of the distribution of the risk factors, and that can give you some insight as to kind of what your program may need to include in order to address those risk factors. A health status assessment. These are typically you're having people self-report what existing conditions that they have. This, depending on how you're using this information, you may be creating a profile um, of a collection of risk factors that if an individual possesses that may be your priority population that your program's designed around. Um, Self screening. So you have your BSE, TSE, so your breast self exam, testicular self exam, and then you also have the ABCDs. And I think, yes, I did say E. That has been updated. So if you're looking at skin cancer, say melanoma, so the A, B, C, D, E's that you should consider. A is the lesion or whatever you're inspecting. Is it asymmetrical? right? Does the shape change from side to side? B is the border, right? So you're looking at the outer edge of the mole, lesion, whatever it is we're looking at, and is it smooth or is it jagged? C, you're looking at the color, right? Is it an uneven splotchy color or is it a solid color? D is the physical diameter of the spot that you're looking at. Is it larger than the size of a pea? And then the E part that I mentioned, sometimes you see it included, sometimes it's not. But E stands for evolving, and basically is the characteristics of the spot. Is it changing over time? Okay. Um, but again, these are examples of self-assessment. So the individual themselves would make the evaluation of these things. Okay, so let's back up to health risk appraisal. So, uh, I'm not sure about this next part. Most often included with the needs assessment process. I can see where that could be true. Health risk appraisals. There's many of them out there that are available. There are consulting companies that are built around performing health risk appraisals on certain groups that you could contract out. So, okay, I can get on board with most often included. But if we look at this given definition, the odds that a person with certain characteristics will die from selected causes within a time span. And I just want to draw your attention to odds. And if we recall back what I was talking about with the different data types and non-parametric versus parametric statistics, and when you see odds used in this way, what they're referring to is a non-parametric statistic known as odds ratio. And if you recall back to when I was talking about non-parametric statistics, there remember that depends on counts or frequency of particular responses. So in an odds ratio, and you can Google this, it's a pretty routine measurement, but basically it's the probability of an event occurring divided by the probability of the event not occurring. So how you want to set this up is you would take so say the event we're interested in has to deal with developing cancer and previous exposure to estrogen, some estrogen level. Well, we would create a 2 by 2 table, and across the top, right, we would label the columns cancer yes, cancer no, and on the side we would label the rows estrogen yes, estrogen no. Then we would take our data, right? Remember, these are just counts. These numbers represent individuals that meet a particular criteria. So in a 2 by 2 table, you're going to have 4 quadrants. So if we have that 4 quadrants and we look at quadrant number 1, that's going to have the characteristic of having cancer and having been exposed to estrogen. Well, we would include the number of people in our population that meet those criteria. So say we have 56, and we're going to label that quadrant as A. If we move to the right, so now we're looking at people that do not have cancer but have been exposed to estrogen. And again, just the number of people that have those characteristics, 274. That's going to be quadrant B. So let's drop down to the second row. So here we're dealing with cancer, people that have cancer but have not been exposed to estrogen. Okay, the count there is 18 people. That's quadrant C. And finally, we're ending with those that do not have cancer and have not been exposed to estrogen. Again, the count is 390, and that would be quadrant D. So basic odds ratio calculation, you would multiply quadrant A times quadrant D divided by quadrant B times quadrant C, and just remember your order of operations. For your numerator, you should have 21,840. divided by your denominator, 4,937, and it gives you an odds ratio of 4.42. Okay, so the way you interpret an odds ratio is it's relative to the number 1. So if the odds ratio is greater than 1, right, then there's an increased probability of an event. If it's less than 1, there's a decreased probability of the event. So with 4.42, you would write it up. Those with cancer are 4.2 times more likely to have been exposed to estrogen. Right. So that's an example of a non-parametric statistic, just using frequencies or counts of individuals with certain characteristics. Okay, so back to the health risk appraisal. Okay, again, planners have those in the priority population complete the questionnaire. Okay, so it's a self-assessment. And typical questions that you see on these HRAs, they may ask you, do you engage in certain health behaviors? It could be, are you physically active? Do you smoke? Do you consume alcohol? It may ask you personal or family health history. Right? Do you have certain conditions? Anyone in your immediate family have those conditions? Right? You're trying to see if there's a genetic link or something else. Demographics, that's your typical census type of data. Um, you know, Gender, race. It may include income, geographic area, uh, any characteristic can describe uh, the individual that has completed the assessment. And then some physiological data. It may ask, it probably definitely going to ask you height and weight, so they can do a BMI calculation. But they may ask you blood pressure, resting beats per minute, you know, whatever the physiological data they need, they can include that on the health risk appraisal. And when you get these results back, so you're collecting data at an individual level, right? So that means every individual participating in the program, we have specific data on them. That can be useful because you can develop a tailored therapy or prescription for exercise or health behavior change to each individual. Well, that's very effective. It's very inefficient. Anytime you have to address each individual on a one-on-one basis, that's going to consume time and other resources. So it may be advantageous to combine all of the individual data and produce a group level report, which would be using typically in the form of averages. Just be aware that an average may not translate back to the individual level, but that's okay because we have the individual level data, and if we need that type of specificity, we can run the analyses. But if you were just given group level data, right, you just have averages for different target populations, you have to be aware of something called the ecological fallacy. And the ecological fallacy is when you incorrectly attribute a group average to an individual situation. I'll just use GPA. So we could calculate a GPA for the class, and we could compare it with other classes. And so we may have in group 1 the GPA is 3.7. In group 2 the average GPA is 2.5. Now, if we were to say, okay, well, those individuals that are in group A, okay, they perform better academically than the individuals in group B. Well, it depends on what the individual GPAs were that went into calculating that average. If you are incorrect, so maybe you say, okay, well, everybody in group A has a GPA over 3.7. Well, there may be individuals in there that have a lower GPA, lower than 3.7. In that case, there's going to be individuals that have a higher GPA than 3.7. But because you incorrectly assume that, okay, everybody in group A has a high GPA. That's the ecologic fallacy. If you were right, say everybody had a 3.7 GPA and it just works out that, the average is 3.7, okay, and you assume that, okay, well, everybody has a high GPA in that group, you're not incorrect, then no ecological fallacy was committed. The problem is, without the individual level data, you never know if you are committing an ecological fallacy. So that can be pretty problematic. Okay, so I mentioned that HRAs, there's consulting firms out there that can come in and conduct those types of things. Um, if you go that route and you want to bring in a contractor to do that, the book suggests some questions to ask, because of, again, we're dealing with personal health information, and you want to make sure any partnerships that have access to that level of data, um, they're reliable, they're trustworthy, they're good quality. So how do you establish this? So, how long has the vendor been in business? The longer they've been in business, it probably they've seen a lot of different um, unique situations, and come up with how to deal with those situations. So the experience that they have and they bring into this is something that you may want to think about. How many other clients have used the instrument? Um, we can establish certain types of validity by how prolific the instrument has been in use. The more people that use an instrument, analyze an instrument, interpret the results, that's going to add to the validity of that instrument. Okay, who was behind the development of the HRA? You want to make sure that individuals involved are aware of the psychometric properties and considerations that go into instrument development. The best price, again, sometimes you get what you pay for, so you know navigate that one a little bit cautiously. Is the vendor willing to share the names of other clients who have used the HRA? Well, if they're willing to share the names of other clients, then they're probably going to be willing to share your name if you become a client. But really, I think what this question is getting at is that you may reach out to other clients and just say, yeah, hey, were you satisfied with the working relationship that you have? Is there any litigation pending against the vendor? Right, that you're always looking for red flags. Is the vendor that should be HIPAA, Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act compliant? Right, are they protecting the identities of the participants in the HRA? Will the vendor store the HR data at a site outside of the United States? Data security is definitely something that you have to consider. You don't want a data breach and this information gets out and is used in a bad way. There may be some liability issues you're going to have to deal with. Customer service, technical assistance, including with the purchase. Of course, if you run into a problem using an instrument, you certainly want to have a resource available to help you mitigate that problem. Technical assistance, maybe, they may give you the raw data. Are you capable of analyzing that data? If not, do they have a service available to help you with that? Who is the key contact within the company of the vendor? So again, if you run into a situation, who do I contact? Am I going to contact some kind of call center, or I'd be more comfortable having a personal sales rep if I were to do this through contracting mechanisms. Okay, so again, with sources of secondary data, so two main groups: data collected by government agencies and data from non-government agencies. So with government agencies, we have this first bullet: some data collection is mandated by law. The specific law would be the Public Health Service Act, right? So it's a federal law, and it kind of goes through the policies and procedures for data collection, and basically it gives the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services the authority to kind of form these policies and guidelines. Others are collected voluntarily. Again, an agency may be collecting data that helps them meet their mission. Um, they're not, otherwise required to do so. They felt that it's in their best interest to collect and analyze that data in order for them to be able to, again, carry out the mission. So at the federal level, you may be looking at things like Department of Commerce, kind of give you some maybe consumer level data. Bureau of Census, certainly a good resource to get a demographic profile. Agency level, CDC conducts the BRFSS, which is the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System, and basically they ask a series of questions pertaining to health and health behavior. The BRFSS only includes adults, so at some point they determined that collecting information from those under 18 and older than 12, that would be beneficial because you're looking at any behaviors adopted at an early age are likely to be carried into adulthood. So the YRBSS was developed and implemented. Another data collection associated agency, the National Centers for Health Statistics, they conduct the National Health Interview Survey and the NHANES, which is the nutrition or the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. Now, one thing I want to say about NHANES, it's a little bit different than the BRFSS, the YRBSS, and the NHIS, in that those are basically facilitated through telephone, right? So you receive a call in the evening, person identifies themselves and ask you if you're willing to participate, and they'll ask you a series of questions, and then you answer those questions. NHANES, they may include some of the similar characteristics with regard to health behaviors, but the way that this is set up is that NHANES is facilitated through mobile laboratories. So they'll actually drive to communities and people step inside the mobile laboratory, sits down with an interviewer, the interviewer asks questions, they provide responses, but the mobile laboratories also collect physical measurements, things like height and weight, blood pressure, DEXA, right, where they take a full body x-ray and look at distribution of adipose tissue. There's also some health education that occurs inside these units as well. So you're collecting the similar type of data, but probably a more robust data set is collected with NHANES. State and local governments, they may collect data on their own, things that they feel would help their location or their locale that isn't being met by data collected at the federal level. Non-government agencies, so you have healthcare systems, right? The community hospitals are doing assessments. Your voluntary health agencies, like American Cancer Association, American Heart Association, Business, Civic, and Commerce Group. Again, each of these organizations have missions, and maybe data is necessary to help them follow those missions. Local agencies and organizations also have data they have collected for their own use. Same type of thing. You may need to kind of dig around to see what data is actually being collected. There's a lot of data out there. One, not many people are aware of, but you also have to consider, even though the data exists, do I have access to it? That's always a question you should ask. All right, so we've talked about when we utilize secondary data, so collecting data from existing records, right? The advantages are it's already there. Just once you get past gaining access, bam, right? You have data to analyze. The disadvantages are just because it's there doesn't mean it's available. Plus, it may be a situation where you didn't get to contribute as to what variables were assessed, so there may be some gaps, or maybe variables being assessed but not in the appropriate data type that you need. And then of course HIPAA, if we're dealing with identified data, there's always going to be protection and regulation surrounding the use of that data. Okay, data from the literature. So here we're talking about using publish research papers, right? Every project I get involved with, right, always involves some type of literature review. And literature review, it seems pretty straightforward, um, but you really need to hone up on your searching technique. Um, identifying the appropriate terms, terms as how they're referred to in the article. Otherwise, if you don't use those terms, you're not, or you may not have that article returned. There's a technique called pearl growing. So if you're reading an article and the article goes in and say, okay, well, this is an extension of such and such research, or building upon the findings of this study, and then they present the source in the bibliography. Well, going to the bibliography and kind of looking through that, this group of authors, when they were writing this manuscript, felt that these sources were important enough to include and to reference in the paper. Well, maybe you should take a look at those references and maybe secure some of them and kind of review them, see if they may be a benefit to you. So databases, PsycInfo, Medline, Eric. Typically, when I'm doing a literature review, I use Google Scholar. Google Scholar is very comprehensive, and plus, it just seems more intuitive when you're searching, because most people are used to searching using the Google environment. Google Scholar is very similar. And with Google Scholar, it looks at your IP address, and not all the articles that get returned in the search you're going to have access to. But if you were to conduct the search on campus, right, Google Scholar recognizes your IP address is associated with FAU, so then you may, well, you definitely will, there'll be more results presented that have links directly to the articles, and this is based off of subscriptions that the library has. So the IP address kind of opens that door. In lieu of being on campus, you can also go to FAU Library's website, and you can enter the virtual library through the proxy portal. And basically, in order to enter into that portal, you enter in your student ID and password, and then once you do that, then it says, okay, you're legit with FAU. Now you have access to the articles that the library subscribes to. Literature search strategy flowchart. If you're trying to do an exhaustive search, then having a flowchart like this helps you stay on track as far as, am I looking down every single avenue for potential studies that are related to what my interests are. Typically, we see a flowchart strategy like this presented with any article that reports on what's called a meta-analysis. And if you're not familiar with a meta-analysis, what we're doing is, we're collecting research articles, and we're looking at the data presented in those research articles, and we're entering that data into an analysis software, and based on sample power and effect size, right, we can detect significant differences. So say if we're studying some intervention, so we'll say wise woman, and we're looking at outcomes that were presented, what they measured. Maybe they looked at blood pressure, changes in blood pressure after participating in the study. Well, you want to find every article you can that does a similar type of evaluation, looking at the impact of wise woman on that blood pressure outcome. So then you take all those results and analyze it. This is an approximation because you don't have the individual level data that the authors of the other studies use to report in their papers. They typically report group level data. So you're combining several instances of group level data into a larger sample size and doing the analysis that way. I kind of got off track there, but the meta-analysis, usually there's a strategy that's presented on how they arrived at the articles used in the study. So here's just going through this generic flow chart. So identify the need or topic. Right, so you got to. I'm doing type 2 diabetes. That's my topic. So how are you going to search and find these? Right, you going to use keyword searches, or is there a particular author that has published heavily in this area? Typically, we're going to go off to the left side and use search terms, match keywords in the thesaurus. Again, this is really just, are you using the appropriate search term? So then you get your identify possible sources, so you get your result returns. Locate those sources. I usually start off with glancing through the abstract to see, hey, is this something that I thought it was based on the title? If the abstract supports that, then I'll go in and read the article. And at that point, usually I'll just collect the article, and then once I have my final collection, I'll go back and look through them and make my judgments on quality of the research. Are there any problems in the research that I see that kind of make me hesitant to use those results? And then organize the literature into usable form. So basically, what parts of the study contribute to what you're trying to do, right? You clip those out and you start to build your own manuscript or report. Okay, using technology to map needs assessment data. So GIS. So GIS, Geographic Information Services. Think of a map. Think of Google Maps, and when you're, or let's think of Zillow. Okay, so Zillow is a real estate website, and you can enter in some search criteria for different types of homes, and then Zillow will return a map to show you where houses or homes that match that criteria are located on your map. And think about how useful that is, or how quick you can kind of see, okay, I see what area this is in. Oh, well, wait a minute, it's next to I-95. Do I want to listen to that, all day and all night long? It just helps you take that information, as opposed to just having a list of street addresses, right? You can quickly look at the map and kind of understand how all that information kind of lays out. We have become a more graphical society, where we want things quickly, at a glance, consume information that way. And the technology that we have today, it makes this the use of GIS more feasible. Probably the first instance of what today we know as GIS, or using mapping the data, was John Snow. And when he was investigating a cholera outbreak in London. And basically what he did was, everybody that was positive for COVID, or gosh, I got COVID on my mind, but everybody that was positive for cholera, he took their home address and he went to a map and basically put a pin on the map indicating where that person positive with cholera, where they live. And after he went through the list, he stepped back, looked at the map, and he could clearly see distinct clusters. And then without going all the way through Jon Snow's story, basically at the time there wasn't indoor plumbing, there was outdoor pumps. A single pump would serve a certain area of the city, and he noticed that these clusters were associated with particular pumps. Okay, his theory was that cholera was spread through water. He went out, removed the pump handles from each of those suspected pumps, and he noticed that there was a sharp decrease in the number of people diagnosed with cholera in those areas. Right, so the visualization pattern allowed him to see this quickly and act quickly. Okay, so now we're down to needs assessment. So we spend a lot of time talking about the importance of needs assessment. So how do you go about doing it? Now, the problem with coming up with a formal list of instructions to conduct the needs assessment is that depending on the situation, depending on your target population, depending on your resources, all of these things add to the variability of what the needs assessment is going to look like. So there isn't one way to do it. We will talk about kind of a generalized framework of steps that you need to carry out, but we'll just kind of go through it and just kind of see what's involved with a needs assessment. Okay, so you have informal and formal approaches. Informal approaches are just that. You're just kind of pulling things together in a way that allows you to get some sense of what is needed in a situation, right? Educated, informed observation. Sometimes you hear this referred to as allegorical data. Hey, there's something I noticed going on, but I really haven't taken the steps to quantify it. But definitely, I sense something's going on. Well, there may be something going on, or there may not be something going on. So that's the problem with these informal approaches. Limited resources, unscientific, less reliable, right? Using that same example, if you're noticing things and you go to someone else and say, hey, here's what I think's going on in this community. Well, the other person may say, well, I don't see that. I don't know what that is. So informal approaches, they may be okay to kind of spark this idea that you need to do a formal needs assessment, but you don't want to just rest on an informal needs assessment. So what does formal mean? It's comprehensive. We're looking at all avenues. We're trying to address all challenges. We're trying to cover all our bases. Okay, scientific or systematic data collection. Right, we're going through a process to collect this data, and we're going to stay true to the process. Circumstances often determine the type. Again, the nature of your situation is going to impact how you're able to do a needs assessment. Right? There's many different ways. Again, I can't give you a one size fits all. But what we can talk about are just some a generalized model for conducting a needs assessment. So the idea is that you follow each of these steps to some degree when you conduct a needs assessment, and the end result should be something that you can utilize. So determining the purpose and scope, of the needs assessment, gathering data, analyzing data, identifying risk factors associated with the health problem, program focus, and validating the need. Okay, so let's step through these. Okay, determining the purpose. What are you trying to do? Why do you need this needs assessment? What do you want the needs assessment to tell you? How much detail do you need the needs assessment to present? Right, so you're going to say, well, what's the goal? Right, what is the purpose? Why am I utilizing resources to collect this information? Okay, what is this data going to allow the planning committee to do, or is it going to kind of illuminate the problem in a way that is more easily seen? How extensive will the needs assessment be? Okay, how much detail do you need in order to make the appropriate decision? And then ultimately, you also have to consider, what resources do I have available to conduct this needs assessment? Right, the first three questions, if you consider this, at a unlimited budget, right, you could come up with a lot of detail, but when it comes to actually facilitating the needs assessment, if you don't have the resources to do it, then you're not going to be able to do it. Okay, gathering data. All right, so now we're thinking about, okay, I know what data I need. How am I going to get it? Okay, so with relevant data, if there's an existing data set, well, you want to make sure that you're collecting data or accessing data that's relevant to your priority population. You may have data available about prevalence of type 2 diabetes, but it's presented at the state level. Well, you're working with a group in Palm Beach County. the prevalence that's reported in the state level data may not be appropriate, or it may not be equivalent to the prevalence rate that's going on in Palm Beach County. So you want to consider that. Again, with secondary data, do you have access to it? Does it address your needs? Primary data, right? Fill in data gaps. So you want to kind of review the existence of secondary data. If it's already out there and it serves your purpose and you have access to it, then use it. Okay. But when you run into a situation where it kind of addresses all my needs, but there's a few things that it doesn't address, then you want to kind of think about, okay, well, do I want to conduct a primary data collection? Okay. Desirable to have both primary and secondary. I don't know about desirable, but it's advantageous if you can do that, because you could conserve resources anytime you use secondary data, as long as the secondary data serves an appropriate purpose. Okay, several models that we may want to consider, and we've talked about these before. So you want to look at the SMART, right? The social marketing assessment and response tool. Right here, we're looking at consumer analysis, market analysis, basically the communication strategies, that sort of thing. The mobilization for action through planning, the MAP. Assessments look at the community and what challenges and opportunities exist within that community that you may want to consider as well. Okay, analyzing the data, all those things that go into do I have the appropriate data types? Am I selecting the appropriate statistical analyses? Do the results help me answer research questions or needs questions that I have? Right? You got to kind of work that out. Pre-seed, proceed, we've talked about that in a previous lecture. So phases 1 through 3, so your social assessment, your epidemiological assessment, your ecological assessment can be used for guidance. So the quality of life in the priority population. How are you going to answer that? Well, you got to have some type of measure for quality of life. You got to collect that data, analyze that data. The results help you to answer it. Social conditions and perceptions shared by those in the priority population. Again, how are you going to assess that? Social indicators. So here we're really getting to know, this is phase 1 stuff in pre-seed, proceed, but we're seeing the issues from the perspective of the priority population that may kind of include some of these social indicators. So number 4, here's where you take those perceptions from the target population and you come up with a way to link it to the health issues that we identify. Again, the social indicators, that's going to be the motivation for many of the people in the priority population. We need that motivation to help carry them through our program. So if we could link those with the health issues we're trying to address, then they're going to bring some motivation to the situation to complete the program. And then moving on, looking at your health problems, which ones are you going to focus on, that sort of thing. So needs assessment, you're doing it to serve a purpose. You have to understand what that purpose is before you set out to conduct your needs assessment. After you analyze the data, okay, so you run your statistical analyses, you also have to look at those results, and you have to interpret the result. What do the results mean in the context that you're trying to use it? The statistical software doesn't know context. It won't assist you with that, right? This is where your literature review, your expertise, your prior knowledge, that all goes into how well you can interpret your results. So after you analyze what's the most pressing need, what absolutely has to be the first thing we focus on. Do we have resources to address that need? Remember the priority matrix I talked to you about. So what's the most pressing need, right? That would be the level of importance. Are resources adequate to deal with the problem? That would be the level of change possibility, right? So we have to consider those within the matrix in order to properly prioritize these things. Can the problem best be solved by a health promotion program, or could it be handled through other means? Perhaps, like with the smoke-free or tobacco-free campus policy. Um, well, some would argue that policy is a part of health promotion, but instead of having an active health promotion program to inform and educate people on um, smoking and the benefits of not smoking and that sort of thing, putting a policy in place, you kind of force people into certain choices. Maybe that's something you want to look at. Are effective intervention strategies available to address the problem? Well, has someone already kind of worked out what works and what doesn't? Does that apply to the situation in terms of location and priority population? Then maybe instead of reinventing the wheel, you can kind of revise the wheel, take an existing intervention strategy that has a proven track record and tweak it to fit your situation. And finally, can the problem be solved in a reasonable amount of time? Um, One thing I'll say about this, if health status is your goal, a change in health status, just be cognizant of how slowly or quickly health status can change. Because at some point, if you're hanging success or failure program on a change in health status, well, do you have enough time for the behavioral changes to kind of have an effect on overall health? Again, something to consider. Okay, so prioritizing our approach, and I uploaded a priority matrix kind of supplement lecture um, as a way to help you kind of come up with a prioritized list of issues. But the book also goes into the basic priority rating model, and it, it, it it's probably a little bit more of a formal approach to a priority matrix. But if we go through this, we can kind of see how it works. So size of the problem. Um, Basically, here we're looking at to what extent is this problem distributed in the population. Um, Probably looking at incident or prevalence rate. Oh, and just since I mentioned incidence and prevalence, so the difference between incident and prevalence. So incident rate, and whenever you have the word rate, it implies that there's a time component. So incident would be the number of new cases over a specified time period. So if we think about COVID, we would look at, the number of new cases that have occurred, say from March 20th to August 20th. The prevalence rate would be the number of new cases plus existing cases, but also you're subtracting out those individuals that uh, either die from the condition, they recover from the condition, or they move out of the area, or no longer considered part of the study group. So, um, so size of the problem, you would look at incidence and prevalence. So you're looking at, again, the distribution, and then the seriousness of the problem. Um, if we're talking about the common cold, how serious is that compared to, say, we're looking at tuberculosis? Okay, there's a difference in seriousness, so you would scale that. Effectiveness of possible interventions. Okay, so you have some interventions, or if interventions are applied to this situation, what kind of outcomes would we expect to see? And then D, proprietary economics, acceptability, resources. So basically your capability of conducting an intervention in this group. They give you this formula. Remember your order of operations. So you do A plus B, and in parentheses, times C, then all of that times D divided by 3. Okay. Um, Again, if you want to go with this route, that's certainly available to you. The priority matrix is just kind of an easy, cut and dry way to simply prioritize from a list of issues that you may have. But the BPR is certainly something you could apply as well. Okay, step 4 in conducting a needs assessment, identifying the risk factors linked to the health problem. Okay, so here we're focusing on those independent variables. Okay, the idea is that if our health problem, that's our dependent variable, if we want to decrease the incidence or prevalence of that health problem, well, the way that we do that is by facilitating change in the contributory causes to that health problem. Or other words, we are looking for independent variables that if we manipulate those variables, if we change them, right, we would expect to see some type of change in the dependent variable or the health problem. Now, it goes on, talks about phase 2 of the precede-proceed model. They were talking about the epidemiological assessment. And here we're looking at risk factors in 3 forms: genetic risk factors, behavioral risk factors, and environmental risk factors. What I'll say about genetic risk factors. Okay, so there are the possibility of genetic risk factors, but when you consider the scope of the health promotion discipline, we really don't get involved with genetic therapies. So even if we identify genetic risk factors, I'm not sure that we could develop a program around those because of feasibility of affecting change. So you may want to note them. That may help you to define a subpopulation within your target population that you may want to work with, but you really wouldn't build an intervention around that as far as changing those genetic risk factors. However, behavioral risk factors, that's really what we're interested in. What behaviors can we change that is going to influence the dependent variable or the health outcome? And then environmental risk factors, certainly there are some environmental factors that contribute to a person developing a particular condition, but we would also look at environmental risk factors that either facilitate or impede behavioral change in the group. So again, here we're just trying to determine a collection of independent variables. Okay, step 5, identifying the program focus. So here we're talking about phase 3 of precede-proceed. Anytime you see predisposing, enabling, and reinforcing factors, that's phase 3. So we're trying to look at, okay, well, what is our program going to address, right? What are those priority issues? You also want to kind of go through some best practices. Right? Are there existing interventions that have shown or have evidence that supports that they are effective at dealing with this situation? How well do those interventions align with what we're doing? The suitability, the feasibility, those types of things. Again, when you reinvent the wheel, you're going to consume a lot of resources. If you just add little revisions to the wheel, okay, you're going to conserve resources. But you want to make sure that it's going to produce the results that you're interested in. Step 6, validating the prioritized need. All right, so you've gone through your needs assessment, and out of that, you've identified the priority that you want to focus on. Are there any other sources of data or the existing studies out there that support your finding that this is indeed a prioritized need? Okay, we would call that concurrent validity. Okay, a health impact assessment, right? So it's defined as a combination of procedures, methods, and tools by which a policy, program, or project may be judged as to its potential effects on the health of a population and the distribution of those effects within a population. So really, what that's getting at is it's looking at is the health promotion program going to have impacts beyond the priority population? Is it going to facilitate changes in the community? Really, it depends on what you're interested in, what change you're interested in, in order to conduct this particular assessment. One thing you may want to look at is, so say you have a health promotion program, you're recruiting people, and really the program is about changing obesity status. And a person signs up for that program, and maybe after a while people start learning what the program's all about, and they start to stigmatize the individual that's taking part in that program, right? A health impact assessment kind of looks at that, or if there was an improvement in overall health status in the community, is there a trickle down effect? Would that now result in less hospitalizations, doctor's visits? Does that free up resources from hospitals to share with the community as far as prevention ideas? So it kind of looks beyond the health promotion program itself and look at the community in which these programs are developed. Now, World Health Organization kind of says, well, these health impact assessments, you must maintain these four values. One is democracy. You want to make sure that anyone that has interest in the program has access to the program within reason, right? If it's a program that's delivered at FAU, I don't necessarily know that you are compelled to include individuals from the surrounding community to be part of this program. But if you're offering a program available to FAU students, you want to make sure that all students are included or have the opportunity to participate should they incline. Really, it's meant to discourage an unequal opportunities to participate, maybe based off of socioeconomic status, right? Maybe there's some kind of entry fee that precludes those on the lower end of the SES spectrum. Okay, equality. Basically here, anybody that participates in the program, right, it's going to be treated fairly, treated equally. Sustainable development. So you're looking at the short-term and the long-term impacts of the program, but also what's going to happen at the end of the program period, right? Does the program just disappear and you move on to your next priority population? Or are you taking steps to identify individuals that could carry on the program in some capacity so that the benefits are still available to the target population? And then ethical use of evidence. The best example I can think of as far as ethical use of evidence is looking at how COVID numbers are being reported. And the raw data is there, but different agencies are pulling together data in certain ways and reporting it in a way that may or may not be, I don't want to say ethical, but may not be telling the whole story. For example, in mid-August, if you go to the Florida Department of Health dashboard and you pull up some of the COVID testing results, from when they first started testing and putting these reports together, they included the total number of positive cases for both resident and non-resident combined. Okay. Then in mid-August, you pull up a report. Everything looks the same, except now when you look at the title, it just says for residents only. Now on the surface, this sounds like it makes sense, and this may probably what was driving this change is that, well, if someone has a test in Florida and then the next day they return home to Rhode Island or whatever, then is that really a problem in the state of Florida, right? The person's no longer in the area, they've gone back to their resident state, and it's not a problem. Okay, I can see that. But now you have to consider, okay, so what happened this fall? Colleges and universities open up. I would suspect that Florida probably has a relatively high number of out-of-state students in our university system. I just, bringing students in from the Midwest or the Northeast, the weather is certainly a draw for individuals to move down here to attend university. Probably more so than in a state like Wyoming. I don't know if there's a lot of out-of-state students that choose to go to Wyoming. There may be, I may be way off base here, but this is kind of my line of thinking. Um, and recognizing that colleges and universities, if we look at art stories around the country, there seems to be hot spots that pop up as a result of college students returning to campus. With the new way that state of Florida is reporting positive results, now only including residents, how many of those students that test positive in the colleges and universities are out of state and therefore wouldn't show up in that report? So that's what I mean. I don't necessarily say that's an unethical thing, and this may be a side effect of trying to separate non-residents that return back to their home states that received a test in Florida. Um, I see why you'd want to do that. Um, but looking at the bigger picture, especially with maybe it's because I teach at a college university, and maybe that's why this is something that's on my mind. But um, again, another kind of sidebar. But here we're talking about the health impact assessment and the four values associated with those. Okay, an organizational health assessment. So here, we're talking about assessments conducted at FAU. There's a student health assessment that goes out. It's not annually; it's several years to go by, but it's good through Owl's Care. You may be selected to receive a survey, ask you some questions. Um, those are certainly viable. Individual employers may do some form of an organizational health assessment. If we look at this first bullet, a recent amendment to the Public Health Service Act encourages employers to implement comprehensive worksite health promotion programs for their employees. And basically, this amendment just makes grants available for work sites to incorporate some form of health promotion. Under the new law, they can utilize those grants for up to 30% of the total cost of coverage to encourage participation. And there's some criteria, some loose criteria for a health promotion program to fit under this particular amendment. But also notice in this amendment, it also goes on to mention that employers can't require participation if they utilize these grant dollars. So reasonably designed has a reasonable chance. A lot of these things are what defines reasonable. Usually if it sounds like something that could be beneficial, then it's probably going to fly. Not overly burdensome, not a subterfuge. A subterfuge just means utilizing deceit, like say, I'm collecting this information, but then I'm going to use it against you later. So maybe we're doing a needs assessment, a health assessment, and I'm trying to identify smokers, and ask a question: do you smoke? Yes or no? Well, then I get the results back, and I say, aha, okay, all those you smokers, I'm going to charge you more for health insurance. No, we can't do that. We shouldn't be doing that. Is not a highly suspect in the method chosen to promote health. Again, we're not using any type of coercion or anything like that to increase participation.